By April 1945, Berlin was a wounded city, and the final major battle in Europe was moving directly toward its streets.
From the east, Soviet armies were closing in with enormous force, determined to capture Berlin and bring Nazi Germany to an end.
The final Soviet offensive was carefully planned, bringing together vast numbers of soldiers, tanks, artillery guns, and aircraft for one last attack. Marshal Georgy Zhukov would lead the main Soviet drive toward Berlin, while other armies moved to close around the German capital.
Before the attack began, Soviet artillery crews prepared their guns for the massive bombardment that would open the road toward Berlin.
The first great obstacle was Seelow Heights, where exhausted German defenders prepared to make one final stand before the road to Berlin.
Before dawn on April 16, the Soviet guns opened fire, beginning one of the largest and most violent offensives of the war.
Searchlights were meant to help the attackers, but smoke and dust reflected the beams, making the battlefield even more confusing for everyone.
The first attacks were costly. Soviet soldiers moved forward through mud, artillery fire, and machine guns, while German troops fought from prepared positions.
Despite heavy losses, Soviet tanks and infantry kept pushing forward, slowly forcing their way through the German defenses around Seelow Heights.
After several days of brutal fighting, the defenses at Seelow finally collapsed, and the direct road toward Berlin was now open.
People inside Berlin could now hear the front clearly. Each day, the artillery sounded closer, and fear spread through the city.
Families moved underground into cellars, bunkers, and railway stations, hoping thick concrete walls would protect them from the battle above.
Germany was running out of trained soldiers, so elderly men and poorly prepared Volkssturm militia were ordered to help defend the capital.
Across Berlin, streets were blocked with rubble, vehicles, and tramcars, turning ordinary neighborhoods into defensive positions for the coming battle. Even heavy anti-aircraft guns were turned toward the streets, where they could be used against Soviet tanks approaching the city center.
As Soviet armies advanced from north, east, and south, Berlin became increasingly isolated, with its remaining defenders trapped inside a shrinking battlefield.
By late April, Soviet troops had entered Berlin itself, and the campaign changed from open warfare into a savage urban battle.
Every building could hide defenders, so Soviet soldiers had to watch windows, rooftops, cellars, and courtyards before moving even a few meters.
Simple barricades became dangerous strongpoints, slowing Soviet vehicles and giving German defenders narrow streets where they could fire from protected positions. German soldiers used damaged apartments as firing positions, attacking from windows and broken walls before disappearing deeper inside the ruins.
Hidden snipers made the ruins especially dangerous, because a quiet window or broken rooftop could suddenly become a deadly firing position.
Below the streets, civilians endured darkness, hunger, and fear, never knowing whether their homes would still exist when they returned outside. Hospitals and emergency stations quickly became overwhelmed as wounded soldiers and civilians arrived faster than exhausted doctors and nurses could treat them.
Orders for new counterattacks continued from the bunker, even as Germany's remaining forces around Berlin were collapsing.
Die met en front, hosten mit wetten dispan feite, excellisen beituxa heintelli klaatswetten die weiblich garni, heife die geexpirtni die voters wetterlissen gefriend, unterwerbaitiert, obscheidseintet.
Official broadcasts continued calling for resistance, but outside the studios, the military reality had become impossible to hide.
Hour by hour, the Soviet ring became tighter, leaving Berlin's defenders with less ground, fewer supplies, and almost no realistic hope of escape.
Soviet artillery continued pounding central districts, destroying defensive positions while adding even more damage to a city already in ruins.
The advance continued district by district, with infantry, tanks, and artillery working together to break isolated German positions across the city. To reach Berlin's government district, Soviet troops had to cross the river Spree under fire and hold the bridges leading toward the Reichstag. At Moltke Bridge, Soviet assault troops met heavy resistance while fighting for one of the key approaches into Berlin's government quarter.
Every advance came at a cost, and wounded men were pulled from the fighting, while new soldiers kept moving forward.
For civilians, survival meant finding water, food, and medicine in a city where normal life had completely disappeared.
At close range, Panzerfaust teams remained extremely dangerous, forcing Soviet tank crews to move carefully through narrow streets and damaged intersections.
Much of the battle was fought room by room, through staircases, hallways, and basements where defenders could appear without warning.
Some German positions remained active underground even after Soviet troops captured the streets above, making the fighting difficult to predict. Berlin's famous landmarks were now surrounded by rubble, a visible sign of how deeply the war had reached into the capital. Near the Reich Chancellery, Soviet troops moved deeper into the political center of Nazi Germany as Berlin's defenses continued to collapse.
For Soviet troops, the Reichstag had become more than a building. It was a powerful symbol of the enemy they had fought for years.
To reach the Reichstag, Soviet soldiers had to cross exposed ground, while German defenders fired from positions hidden among the surrounding ruins.
On April 30th, Soviet assault groups reached the Reichstag, beginning another fierce battle inside one of Berlin's most symbolic buildings.
Inside the Reichstag, Soviet troops moved carefully through damaged corridors as German resistance continued deeper inside the building.
Soviet troops gradually fought their way upward, forcing the remaining defenders away from key positions inside the building.
Deep below Berlin, Hitler's inner circle remained inside the bunker as the final hours of the Nazi regime approached. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler died inside the Führer bunker, while Soviet forces closed around the center of Berlin.
With Hitler dead, Berlin's remaining commanders faced the inevitable end.
German representatives began approaching Soviet lines under white flags, searching for a way to end the fighting inside the city.
Soviet and German officers met to discuss surrender, as Berlin's remaining defenses were finally beginning to collapse.
On May 2, 1945, Berlin's remaining defenders surrendered, bringing the battle for the German capital to an end.
Thousands of German soldiers were taken prisoner while Soviet troops secured neighborhoods that had been battlefields only hours before. When the gunfire finally faded, civilians came back above ground and found entire neighborhoods changed beyond recognition.
The battle had left enormous suffering behind, affecting soldiers and civilians alike through death, injury, hunger, fear, and displacement. The Red Army had won the battle, but the soldiers who survived Berlin carried the exhaustion and losses of years of war.
Damaged Reichstag now stood over a defeated capital, becoming one of the clearest symbols of Nazi Germany's final collapse.
When the battle ended, large parts of Berlin lay in ruins, and Nazi control over Germany had effectively collapsed.
Few doty concerning in the Assententi 50 centals, for sometimes rook ablike of itself.
The Battle of Berlin marked the final destruction of Hitler's regime and became one of the last devastating chapters of the war in Europe.